Oh, today's gospel, it does not sound like something from the life of Jesus. He is quite uncharacteristically not compassionate at all to begin with. And one wonders what's going on. What could have been a kind of a barrier, maybe a prejudice that barred him from extending his usual mercy and compassion to all. And we are taught that Jesus loved all and helped them. But here, first he's silent, just ignores. That's even worse in a way. And then he refuses to help this woman on account of her being a foreigner. In fact, not only he says no, but it seems, or it sounds like it, that he actually insults her with a derogatory word. We don't know, and it's debated how insulting the word dog would have been. There are some scholars who say that there were actually two words for a dog, and he chose a gentler one, like a domestic companion as opposed to a feral scavenger, despised and feared by all. Fine, but it is still a hierarchical a phrasing that he used. So this is dogs, and then there's children, and the children are above the dogs, and therefore this woman, on account of her ethnicity, is a step below Israel, the Israelites. So this woman is referred to as Canaanite here in Matthew, and then as a Syro-Phoenician woman in Mark. So these are the two Gospels that tell us the story quite consistently, apart from just calling her two different words. And don't you all know what it's like, though, to be rejected? To be told no? I think kids actually know it better than anybody, in a good way, hopefully. But we've all felt rejection, when we've all felt humiliation and been put down at various times in our lives. But I think it hurts so much more when it's based on something you cannot change, like your ethnicity, or gender, or accent, sounding different from other people, or looking different, or having different capabilities physically. So surely you'd expect more from Jesus here, and for that reason, yes, this is a challenging story for us to hear. I do think it's really hopeful in one way, and I will try to tell you why I think that. I think it's, it is to me, because nobody remains stuck at the end of the story in the place where they began. So this lady, she managed to change Jesus' mind. Can God change his mind? The everlasting and never-changing, always all-knowing God. And many have debated that theological question. Then there's the question of if Jesus was God, or maybe he wasn't so much like God if he changed his mind. But what does that mean for the fullness of the incarnation? If we believe that Jesus was fully human, and humans change their mind, in a good way, many times, then surely it would have been important and possible for Jesus to learn from others, to revise his own assumptions about people, categories, who are clean and unclean, dangerous and pleasant, who are our people and others. And to whom does God really want us to extend mercy and grace and consider them our neighbors? And I think we actually read a lot in the Gospels about these questions. And Jesus' ability to learn from this foreigner, in fact, his humility and openness to do that, tells us a lot about the incarnation and how we are to live into its reality. Because like everyone else, I think Jesus was revising and learning and figuring out whom to accept and whom to reject. The trick was, of course, that his listeners hung on every word of his. So I think in addition to his inherited prejudice, he was also aware of that of whoever was listening. And he was an emerging rabbi with a reputation. In fact, the reputation so great that this lady who was a foreigner sought him out. He was clearly a known healer by then, and she attributed these powers to him, and others attributed knowledge and wisdom to him. So I think there was a lot at stake in terms of what answer he would give. So as many wise people, the first thing to do when you don't know what answer to give, you just buy yourself some time and don't answer. But then, what happens? Why the use of such derogatory language? And why not heal a child? Again, what prejudice could have been so great that it barred Jesus from helping? Now, the woman, she changed his mind. That is more than other characters in the Bible could do. She, first of all, figures out that this is a powerful individual. Then she has this kernel of hope that even though she is a foreigner, the God who made this healer so powerful will still accept her. And so the first thing she does is she calls Jesus by his title, given to him by his people, Son of David. And then her genius is that she did not reject Jesus's insulting language. I'm going to call it that. Never mind the domestic and feral distinction. I do think that Jesus used insulting, dehumanizing language here. But she takes it, accepts it, doesn't argue that language per se. She kind of flips its logic back to Jesus, combines her first assumption with that. First assumption being that God is open to healing everybody, and Jesus is the one who is Lord and therefore has access to this power. She combines it then with Jesus' logic, that it's not fair, that the dogs should never be fed before the children, and she flips it on its head and says, well, if I'm beneath the table, like a little less human than what you're suggesting, than who you're suggesting is deserving, then even there, even beneath the table, God's grace and mercy is so great that it will reach me even there, even at that lowliest place. So she's got this intuition that God does not abandon anybody, even though he might show favor to some. So even though God chose Israel, he will not abandon the rest of us. And that no matter what categories we slot people in, God is greater than our ways of putting people in boxes and figuring out how the world works based on our assumptions, which are often inherited. So this is the pivotal point in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Remember, 2 weeks ago, we looked at some symbolism in the feeding miracles, when Jesus multiplies a limited amount of food and makes it a great amount of food. And of course, the question was, will there be enough? And now it kind of builds on this and says, who is deserving to eat? But it's after this encounter that in Matthew, the second feeding miracle comes. The one that, based on its symbolism, the scholars say feeds the Gentiles as opposed to the Israelites. So 2 weeks ago, I went into some detail to say why scholars think that way. But it looks like this encounter leading into the feeding miracle that was directed to the Gentiles as opposed to the Jewish crowd kind of widens the scope of Jesus' entire ministry. And it's from there that the gospel recounts his travels into foreign territories and interactions with Gentiles, and basically just opens up the possibility of grace for all of us, which for us is important because otherwise we wouldn't be here eating the bread of life and collecting all its crumbs really carefully as well. Now, so just to return to this, what was the problem for Jesus with narrowing the scope of his ministry, that made him narrow the scope of his ministry only to the Israelites? What was the root of the prejudice? Well, the root was the history of the relationship between the Israelites and those who dwelt in the so-called promised land of Canaan. We read today from the Old Testament the beginning of that story, I would say. The beginning is with Abraham, the real beginning that we read earlier this summer. But today we also heard how the Jewish people ended up in Egypt for a period of time. So then we'll read some more about how they then left Egypt. And then after they left, and after they traveled in the wilderness, they came back to Canaan. And what transpired after was the destruction of the Canaanite people. Not complete erasure, because what the rest of the Old Testament tells us is that then the Israelites kept falling into the Canaanite religious practices and then rejected them, and then fell back into them and rejected them. And that just went on and on. And so there was this history of hostility. There was this history of perceiving the Canaanites as though they tempted the Israelites to fall into those practices. This may sound maybe like a feminist angle on this, but I don't want to juxtapose the genders too much, but there is this perception that men expressed for a while that it's women who tempt them to act in ways for which they're actually responsible. So, and this metaphor is in the Old Testament as well, that the Canaanites were seducing the Israelites to follow these abhorrent practices that were legitimately against the law set out in the Torah. But it's as though the Israelites didn't have that responsibility to resist themselves. Well, they did have that responsibility, and they knew it, and I think that contributed to the hostility and the angst in that relationship. But I would, maybe this is a strong word, but to me, the history of the Israelites in Canaan is genocidal. So they were motivated by their conviction that they had a special relationship with God, that God told them to go in to the promised land and to kill its inhabitants. That's what the Old Testament records. I am not going to propose here whether or not this is factual and how exactly God operated in that instance. I'm just going to call it that. And I'm going to say that, most importantly, this kind of thinking persists in the world. That a group of people who thinks that they're superior, often based on the conviction that God made them superior or closer to him, then feels entitled to displace, to kill, to subjugate, to enslave. This is true of this world, not only of the world long ago, the time of this Canaanite conquest, or even mid-last century. This is true of the world today. We've all watched on TV. In fact, it unfolded before the eyes of the whole world about 12 years ago. The killing of the Yazidi people in Iraq by ISIS, killing and enslaving, killing the boys and the men, taking the women and the girls, in fact, holding them in the ordinary homes as slaves, where you'd look at the house from the outside, looks like a completely normal household, but what goes on inside could only be permitted within the consciousness of those people, or conscience of those people, by the assumption that those whom they enslaved, displaced, and killed are somehow lesser humans than them. Otherwise, I don't think anybody could allow ourselves such acts. How is this ordinariness of such a crime possible? We, of course, also see what's going on in Palestine with Israel. That one, I'm not going to go into it too much because it's disputed, and there are reasons for that. But some bodies, as part of the UN, have discerned genocidal intent on behalf of the authorities of Israel in that situation. So, yeah, it's not in distant past that you get this pattern, that first you think you're special, then you call somebody else using dehumanizing terms. That's a key step. Language shapes thought, political thought as well. And I want to spend more time on it next week, actually, but leave it now as that. As first comes the assumption of superiority, next comes the language, and next comes the destruction. And it's the adults who sort out the legal implications, whether or not Israel is truly behaving in ways that some suggest. But the adults hammer it out, but the children are there, and the children don't understand why they're suffering alongside their parents and others. So the child in this story, to me, is the most important character. The absent child. The same way as the children are absent from the decision-making in the world, this girl, on whose behalf the mom advocated, she knew nothing about the history of her people, their religious practices from hundreds of years ago. She didn't know why suddenly it was decided that her people were not deserving of God's grace, or the Yazidi kids never knew why they were called devil worshippers and considered subhuman. The Jewish kids didn't know it in the middle of last century and many other times. So this child is present as part of the story, but in ways that the children are present in all conflicts in the world today, which is to say, unknowingly and bearing no responsibility for it. So the heroism of her mom here is to make Jesus, this presumably powerful person, see her kid as human. Not as a category, not as a Canaanite, not as a idolatrous person based on the practices of her people, not as an absent one about whom we might argue theologically, not as a dog or a puppy, but as a human, a child worthy of compassion. And it worked. So if Jesus could change his mind, surely we can as well. And what does it take us to revise our views? And most importantly, let's spend some time this week noticing our use of language. What do we call people whom we consider beneath our station? And what does that use of language do to our thoughts about them? Street people, vulnerable people, addicts, we use these terms. And that's just one example. But let's consider how language shapes thought, and I'll spend some more time next week about it. And to conclude, I would just make one link. And this is to say that this story about the crumbs under the table found its way in the 16th century into one of the most well-known prayers that we have said as Anglicans for centuries, and now pushed back against, I think. Some people still love the rhythm of the prayer of humble access, and some people cannot stand it because it creates this dichotomy, this sense of human unworthiness. But do you remember this one? We're not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs under thy table, but you are the same Lord whose property is always to have mercy. So this prayer is directly informed by this passage, so I thought it's worth mentioning in the Anglican context. And I also want to give Thomas Cranmer a bit of an excuse here. As much as we perceive this prayer as an indication of human unworthiness, that God kind of just tolerates us because he's merciful, fine, these creatures who sin, God is going to just allow us the access to his table. I think it's not quite like that. I think that we have infinite worth as humans, all of us. Those whom we consider the others and ourselves. Jesus showed it in this encounter that he eventually came round to. And that worth, however, is not made by us. It's created through God's mercy, through God's very property, not a reluctant kind of changing of his mind, but his property is always to have mercy and always to treat all his creatures as infinitely deserving and infinitely worthy to him, because he created us in his own image, the image of a merciful God. And therefore, maybe we don't know enough about God. We don't have a good theological system necessarily. It gets challenged, it gets revised. Our inherited faith, just as Jesus's and the woman's here, can change, can become more comfortable with ambiguity, with lack of categories. But we know that God calls us to be merciful, to act in his image, out of his image. And so I hope that we can learn from each other, from exposure to all sorts of different people in our lives, to treat everybody like God's creature, and to be assured that we also have the same worth. And that a crumb here is actually not something tiny. It's the same amount of God's mercy is present in one crumb in our Eucharist as there is in the whole bread. So I will end with this hopeful note. And that's why I think this story is hopeful, even though it's challenging. And every year, different thoughts pop into my mind as I read it. Thanks be to God.